Well, hello, extraordinary community. I've just dipped into messages in 723 different social media platforms and came across a large number of accumulated messages about the breakup of Russia. And I'm going to commit a crime here together with you because there are certain topics about which you should either say quite a bit or not speak at all. And I just picked out a few questions about this issue of the potential breakup of Russia. And this might go very badly, but I'll try to take them with very brief answers, which I don't know where they're going to go, and think of it as a kind of little appetizer to a more systematic conversation about this. We're going to have, for sure, on the main channel at some point, and probably more properly here, and maybe even in dialogical form with, in 2023 with folks who are experts in this field. So you have probably encountered this question in a context of war, in a context where there's Ukraine that is on the wrong end of terroristic bombardment and invasion. You've got a situation with a largely depoliticized population in Russia. You've got a fair number of Russian opposition folks who are now in the West engaging in discourse about the war or about Russia's future. So the odds are you're coming across this issue in that kind of context, and the odds therefore are that you're not going to be coming across good quality discussion of it very often, because it's going to be instrumentalized in good ways and in bad ways. So what are we talking about when we're talking about this, right? If we're having a coffee and we're abstracting ourselves beyond 2023, it could be a coffee we have in 2020 in the past or in 2030. And we're not necessarily focusing on today's events. What kind of conversation is it? Well, it's a conversation about something that has been very painful for a lot of thinking Russians or people with a partly Russian identity like me from the beginning of the war and earlier. And that's that for all of the extraordinary achievements of Russian culture has failed to manifest in or tie itself to a healthy political culture. It had opportunities to do that. They were missed. So you're talking about a failure of Russian politics to accommodate itself with Russian culture, and a failure of Russian culture to accommodate itself with Russian politics. And the degree of incapacity for marriage between the two is, in Russian history, over more than just decades, over centuries, extraordinary. And so, as we are having a coffee, the next thought naturally comes along. Well, if it's so bad, why not have Russian culture without Russian politics? Now, that might not work out very well, but this hasn't worked out very well. So that's, I think, how I'd frame the issue. You're looking at an historical space which has found it more difficult than some other historical spaces to create a constructive coexistence between its politics and its culture. So let's take a couple of questions. The Ukrainian parliament has recognized the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria as independent, and Tatarstan, and maybe others could be on the list. Are these moves by Ukraine PR, or do they actually have an impact? It's not PR. It's not PR because it's politics. And I actually think that on balance it's rather good politics. And I actually think Zelensky is skilled at, without much energy being allocated to it, just inserting a wedge here and there every time he sees a crack. And that's never something that's going to have a fundamental causal impact on whether Russia has bits breaking off, or whether Russia breaks up, or whether Russia stays unified. But it certainly adds something to the scale, and therefore it's politics, and it's effective beyond just being PR. And it's impossible to predict what outcome here is going to be better than we might expect, or worse than we might expect. So without having that confidence, we can still gently guess that this is constructive and appropriate politics. Who should I listen to learn more about the possibility of Russia's breakup? Well, actually, I think we've just said what the answer is. And that's that you don't want to learn about this issue in the context of war discourse. So my tip would be to listen to academic experts who might sometimes say, when asked, do you think Russia is going to break up? No, it's very unlikely. Or who might say, yeah, it's a very major possibility. Well, ask the one, or hear the one who says it's a major possibility, be asked, is that good or bad? And their answer should be, I don't know. There could be exceptions to this, but if their answer is, I don't know, that's an indication of epistemic credibility. What's the difference between the Russian Empire collapsing, the Putin regime collapsing, and Russia breaking up? Now, I think there are different conceptions of empire, and there is a lighter conception of empire that I use, and that one would certainly qualify the United States as an empire, and that's simply a major power which is interested in and systematically pursues its interests by manipulating states and manipulating markets, trying to control states and trying to control markets across the globe. And therefore, I would say that if Russia remains a unity, even if it gives up the ugly imperialism that we're all seeing, that kind of imperialism light, it seems to me, is inconceivable for Russia to give up, as long as it remains a unity. It's going to be interested, at least in a regional way, of exercising control over states and markets around it. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to have to be as destructive as what's happening now. It could be done via soft power 100 years from now. But I don't see that bit falling off, that lighter version of imperialism falling off, unless Russia disintegrates. What would a broken up Russia, a world without Russia, look like? I've had that question several times. We don't know. But it would be potentially a set of different political entities. Some could be authoritarian, some could be democratic. it's very difficult to imagine how this would happen without considerable violence. And it's also not inconceivable, given the remarkable contingencies of history, that Russia breaks up and reunifies over the next few centuries. Now, all of these require proper answers that, of course, I'm not giving. But we will get there. What's the best case scenario for Russia's breakup? I think the best or the least worst scenario for Russia's breakup is for the federal structures that exist now to roughly align with the formation of new states. And for that process to rely on some of the structures of governance that were being built up in the 1990s regionally, and then got little by little, with every year, virtually asphyxiated by the Putin regime. That ain't necessarily going to make it pretty, but it might make it smoother. Is it fair to say that the Russian opposition is against the breakup of Russia, and are they wrong? I mean, that's an extraordinarily big question, and it requires many answers. I think that the key thing that more people in the Russian opposition need to understand is that pluralism is needed, pluralism of messaging. There's a risk among the Russian opposition in Europe to sort of try to idealize their audience into a demographic that can be described as though that were a single Russian citizen in Russia, that they're addressing them. Whereas in fact, I think there are different messages for different demographics. And so that's why the very idea of unifying opposition messaging is, it's not incoherent, but it's a real mistake. And that might be one of the criticisms of Alexei Navalny's historical approach. But that kind of plurality of messages shouldn't lead to the kind of conflict that currently exists among the Russian opposition. Because they should say, well, we are talking about there being a sort of train, and we are engaging with different Russians in different ways about jumping on that train for different reasons. And that train might be very roughly categorized as a departure from authoritarian imperialism. But we can cooperate and engage in constructive conflict rather than have bad quarrels with each other, even though our messages are different and our messages are aimed at slightly different demographics. I think there is also a risk of over-ethicizing debates for the Russian opposition. In other words, it doesn't make sense to have an ethical debate about Russia's breakup. Nobody is going to decide whether Russia breaks up or not. It is one possibility among several possibilities. And it may become realer over time, and then one's going to have to respond to that. But it's not as though you have got some kind of political power, it's, in your hands to decide on this matter. So there's a risk of a sort of farcically abstract factionalism when you've got these people saying Russia's breakup is inevitably going to be terrible and Russia's breakup is going to be good. Well, it's like people debating whether it should rain. It will or it won't. I'm being facetious, but I'm using that exaggeration to make a point. And in just the same way, it's eminently constructive for Russians to debate, oppositional Russians, to debate a post-Putin future. But there is also, a risk when conversations get too intense and too conflictual about which kind of parliamentary democracy Russia should have, because that really might be a sort of debate about, how many baths and showers you're going to have, when in fact all of that needs to be settled after you encounter the new house you're going to have to rebuild, not before. But that's not to say that it's impossible to create a set of visions for Russia's future and to begin aligning around a set of principles here. And that is what some of the Russian opposition are trying to do. Some of them can do it better. But overall, I would say you've got to be very conscious about this issue, the possibility of Russia's breakup. But it shouldn't be excessively ethicized and excessively conflicted about prematurely at this stage when we don't know how this is going to go. So I think that a little bit of very, very preliminary commentary on this issue. And again, here the pluralism is important. Some Russian opposition may be engaging some Russians around the issue of living in a world with Russian identity and Russian culture, but no Russian politics. Other opposition may be very explicitly engaging folks around particular political structures that they feel would be constructive and would be appropriate in a post-Putin Russia. So pluralism matters, and also not fetishizing an historical development as though it were an entirely ethical debate over which it's worth to throw all of your, toys around and quarrel. So that's a little bit. I hope it was of some use. I'm not sure, because I really feel this needs much more foundation before we begin just throwing these kind of little snippets around. But I gave it a go. Hope it was of some value. Lots of love. Talk soon.